Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm so excited about this week because it's going over one of my favorite things to use in a mix, compressors. Now, in this video, we're just going to be talking about some of the basics, what they might sound like, what do all these knobs even mean, and kind of give a handle of what is a compressor and what is it doing to a track, and then we're going to take it to the extreme and see and hear exactly what it's doing, and then figure out a nice little middle ground that we might want to use, let's say, on this vocal that I got up here. Now, vocals, what we're talking about with a compressor, it's a dynamic processor, meaning dynamics, meaning level. It controls level. That's basically all a compressor does. It's just an automatic level reducer, actually. Now, you've probably heard like, oh, use compressor to get your mixes to sound fatter or fuller or louder. And yeah, they can do that, but in their essence, they're really actually designed to make things quieter. And there's something you have to do in order to make them be louder. But anyway, let's talk about these controls here. So every single piece of audio has what's known as a dynamic range. Okay, dynamic range just meaning what's the loudest part of a recording, what's like the quietest part of a recording. In this case, would this be the silence in between here, which we'll find out is not very silent. And then what's everything in between. So that's our dynamic range. The highest peak and the lowest level is the range in which our dynamics live. Okay, that's our dynamic range. Now, the first thing in a compressor that you should know, the first parameter is this thing called thresh or threshold. All right. Now, threshold just meaning we're setting this threshold to be basically when do we want to have the compressor turn on. Okay. If your level is anything below this threshold, you'll see if I press play here.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast.
That red ball there that's going up and down that line is representing the peaks of your waveform, right? The loudest parts of your waveform. Anything below this line is as if the compressor might as well just be turned off. Anything above this line, that's when we start to get into compression territory and where all these controls start to affect it, right? But nothing happens to your audio unless the dynamic range, the audio, the level of your audio is above that threshold line. It's going to look different on different compressors, but on this one we can actually adjust it. So first thing I'm going to do is just going to make sure that line is somewhere in the dynamic range.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast.
That's fine for right now. Okay. Now, if you said that, oh yeah, I can definitely hear the compressor compressing, that sounds great. I'm sorry to say, there's nothing going on yet. There's no compression happening on this track because yes, it's going above the threshold, but the next thing we have to adjust is something called ratio. This is by far the thing that is the most misunderstood in a compressor. So what a ratio is a fraction. That's all a ratio is. A ratio of 1 to 1 right now that we have here, and that's normally how you would say it, is 1 to 1 or 2 to 1 or 10 to 1. This means that anything above this threshold gets reduced to the same amount that was going above it. So there's a 1 to 1, there's no difference between 1 and 1. So there's no compression happening. But let's say if we go to 2 to 1, if I can make it do it. I could type it in, but let's do that. So 2 to 1. 2 to 1 just means, anything above this threshold, any level amount above this threshold, we're going to reduce it by half, right? So if I go up 2 dB, I'm going to go down to 1 dB. If I go up 10 dB, I'm going to go down to 5 dB and so on, right? It doesn't matter how much I go above the threshold, that's the amount that's the ratio it's going to be reduced to is set by this fraction here. So normally most mixing scenarios a ratio of 2 or 3 to 1 is usually going to be your bread and butter. We'll talk about higher ratios when we get into limiting. So our threshold and our ratio. Now let's press play and see where our audio is.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast. He was a Midwestern boy on his own.
Cool. So you can probably hear very little difference between that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to slam this, as they say, and make this threshold really low into the dynamic range. Okay. Now I'll turn it off and I'll turn it on, and you'll hear a major difference.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast.
Now, right when I turned it on, you heard the level just completely drop, right? That's because it's like we said before, compressors are automatic level reducers. They automatically lower the level of the peaks of your audio, or what's known as transients, the beginnings of your waveform usually. And we have to do something in order to make up for it. And it's this button, this other button that has a color is gain. I'm going to do something that you should do on every single processor. We've talked about this with EQ, but this is the same with compression. We want to have the output match our input, so we're getting a decent level on the output. So I'm just going to be looking at my meters here and using my ears and bypassing this and setting this level here. Okay, here we go.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast. He was a Midwestern boy on his own. She looked at him with those soft eyes so innocent and blue.
Awesome. Now let's bypass it and see what the difference is.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast. He was a Midwestern boy on his own.
Cool. So you probably hear the vocals sound a lot more forward. They sound a lot more, they sound really in your face, right? They sound a little more, maybe more aggressive or more on top of the microphone, maybe. But you hear some other things happen when you do this. One is that there's this hiss, this tape hiss that's going on in the background. And there's also this reverb that's printed on this vocal. You start to hear that a lot more. The reason why is because what we just did, we took our audio, the peaks of our waveforms here, and we smashed them down with this threshold. We set this threshold level down way down to the dynamic range. And then we took our gain and brought the whole level up. So we smashed our audio and then brought the level up. Let's see what that might look like in another track. I'm just going to pull up another, I'll make it stereo audio track. I'm just going to route the audio of this into here and then print it so that we can see how much this compressor changes the level. I'm just going to call this vocal print so we know the difference. And let's record. And we can mute the output of this. Here we go. Awesome. So I'm going to make these tracks the same height. And as you can see how the tops of the waveform look a lot smoother, around the same height as everything else. So everything is louder, right? But then see, not only are the peaks all closer together, but see this noise floor down here? This has become much louder than our original signal here, right? So we have our original signal here and our compressed signal here. Now we can really see and tell the difference between the two here. I'll make sure I get my output back out.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast.
And then the compressed one.
She stood there bright as the sun on that California coast.
You hear a lot more hiss, right? So all that comes out as well, okay? Let me go to a different section here. And we'll hear something else come out with a really rough amount of compression. Okay, so again, we're just all we did was put the threshold on very, very low. I don't recommend doing this. This is just so we can hear what compression is doing, and then we adjust our ratio to be 3 to 1. So anything that goes above that threshold gets reduced 3 to 1, and then we took the output and increased the level so it matches the output. Or it matches the level coming in. We do this because when you started your mix, you've moved your faders, you've got a good balance without any effects, and then you start to add processing, right? If we put a compressor without what we call gain compensating, we'll just lose our mix very, very, very quickly, especially if you're putting compressors on a lot of different sources. So let's listen to this section here and see how it might fare with the compression. And tell me, and you guys won't be able to tell me, but I'll tell you what you probably hear if I had it soloed.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking so right in her diamonds and frills. All those big city nights, in those high rolling hills, above all the lights.
I mean, I love doing this to this track because Bob Seger is just like an American classic, and he's giving it his all. And you can really tell with a lot of compression, because what you probably hear is that his breathing is really, really loud.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking.
It's so loud that it's almost distracting. You know, is this guy going to lose consciousness while he's singing this song? And it's all an illusion because we've just added compression to his vocal. If we take that away, we can still hear that breathing. That's important. You know, that reminds us that a human is behind this. But too much compression can add a lot of unwanted sounds that are down the bottom of a vocal, especially a vocal. So without the compression,
in those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills,
the breathing sounds really nice and natural. With the compression, again, it's the same level, right? And it's going to sound louder, but other things are louder too.
in those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills.
So we can usually tell how much that effect is going to happen by looking at a meter in our compressor called gain reduction. That's this meter here, okay? Anything that says GR on a compressor or anything that has some type of VU meter on it, that's going to tell you how much the compressor is reducing the level of your track, okay? So in this case, I found that anything that's reducing more than 6 dB, it's always going to be in a dB rating, in your dBFS rating. Anything more than 6 dB, you start to really hear the compression. You start to really hear that it's the vocals being affected. In this case, we have almost over 20 dB of compression. Okay, that's peak reduction, right? The transient reduction, the highest points of your dynamic range are being reduced, and then we're adding 16 dB of our what's known as our noise floor, right? The lower parts of our recording, right? So you hear a lot more the room tone, you hear the reverb, but you also hear that breathing that can be really, really distracting. So a lot of compression can be cool, but just be mindful of some of the things that are going on in the background that you may not want to bring out. This is by far, in a live recording, this is always a problem because there's mic bleed. There you might be playing right next to a drummer, and the cymbals are bleeding into a mic, and you can't compress like you normally would if you had everything isolated, right? So this is why we spend so much time making sure things are isolated in a recording scenario, so we have a little more leniency in the mix. Okay, so that's threshold, gain, and ratio. Remember, ratio is just a fraction. That's all it is. Right, reducing it to a third of of the level that goes above the threshold, or a tenth or a 20th or whatever it might be, right? Good ratio to stick with is 2 to 1, 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1. And then threshold, just make sure that is in the range of your audio, okay? The dynamic range of your audio. And gain compensate to match the level of your input. Let's apply, before we move on to these other settings like knee, attack, and release, let's see how this compares to other compressors. Okay, I'm going to bypass this one, Command click, and let's open up this one here. All right. Now it looks totally different, different color scheme, everything. It's going to react almost exactly the same. Okay. We have our threshold. We have all these we have our gain. We have our ratio, right? All the same controls. We're just going to be slightly different. So let's try to navigate this and get the same effect that we did on the last one.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking so right. In her diamonds and frills, all those big city nights, in those high rolling hills.
Here comes those breaths. Here we go.
Above all the lights, she had all of the skill.
Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Let's take this record off so we don't loop back.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking so right. In her diamonds and frills.
Cool. So you get the sense of that. Of that. Let's try it on a different compressor and see how it might change. There's this one here. Now this one's very different in that there's very little output here. There's this knob called gain, and then peak reduction, and then this output control. Let's move this around. We have output, we have reduction, and then we have gain. Yeah, it's weird. So what this is, all this is doing is controlling the meter. It's not going to change how anything sounds. Almost always with any meter like this, like a VU meter, like we've talked about before, you're going to want to see the reduction, right? Not necessarily the level, but the reduction. But the things we don't see, we do not see threshold, and we don't see ratio. That's because these compressors, this is modeling an LA2A compressor. Some of you may be familiar with it. The threshold and the attack and release and one other thing I'm forgetting, ratio, are all are all preset, and they're all going to be exactly the same no matter what you do to this compressor. All you do is have the level meet the built-in threshold, and then tell it how much you want to reduce the level of it with this peak reduction. So it's just these two knobs, makes it easy, all right, and see what we get out of it.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking so right. In her diamonds and frills, all those big city nights, in those high rolling hills.
Okay, so this one's reacting a little bit different. Next week we're going to be talking about the difference between like this one and other ones. But have you noticed that like the first word is like pretty like loud, and then all the other words are really, really quiet.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills,
right, compared to the original.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills.
But the overall level is about the same.
In those Hollywood nights, in those Hollywood hills, she was looking so right. In her diamonds and frills.
That's because we don't have attack and release settings. So what are those? Let's go back to our original one here. And look at the difference between the levels here. Now, if you were on the Monday meeting and saw you may have seen me go over the different attack and release settings of different instruments, or excuse me, of different compressors. But let's go over it here. So, attack is how quickly do you bring the level down once it crosses that threshold? How quickly does the compressor do that? Okay. And this will affect the attack of your recording. Okay. Release will affect how quickly the compressor goes back to its normal state or its nominal state after it's reduced the audio and the audio goes below the threshold, particularly at the very end or the tails of the audio. Okay. We'll be talking about that in the next video, okay? The differences in attack and release setting. But for now, focus your energy on knowing what threshold, ratio, and gain are, and knowing how to spot them in different compressors. And if they're not present, if there's no knob associated with it, like on this one here, there is no that means it is built in and there is no adjustment. The only thing that you can be adjusted is the input, and for this one, threshold, and this would be time constant. This is actually the attack setting here for this particular compressor. Okay, great. Well, I hope that was helpful, guys. We're going to be talking about more nitty gritty attack and release settings on this next video, but I hope this one served you well. See you in the next one.